The 16 Types as Leaders, ISTJs. This is going to be a series where I talk about great leaders of each type. The leaders mentioned in this series will include people from politics, the army, business, and also thought leaders and spiritual leaders. Basically anyone who could warrant the term. The Duke of Wellington. Habit is 10 times nature. In certain analyses of who was the greatest military leader, the Duke of Wellington actually came out on top. This was surprising to some people, since he was very risk-averse, conservative, and cautious in his approach. I think people expect the great military leaders to have to be bold, or to constantly be winning against great odds. But the Duke of Wellington would make sure that the odds were in his favour as much as possible from the get-go. For example, he would be fastidious about the supply lines, prioritising his men being fed at all times. Hungry men are a recipe, so to speak, for feeble and disobedient armies. Seems like an obvious idea, and it is, but many other great generals, commanders, and leaders would be highly risk-taking in this regard, perhaps assuming that they could live off the land when invading an area, only to find that their opponents had adopted a scorched earth strategy, where they burned their own crops to prevent invading forces from feeding off them. I think that Wellington exemplifies so many of the virtues of the ISTJ type. He was meticulous and detail-oriented in his planning. He was a disciplinarian, a person of principle, someone who was quite traditional in many ways, completely no-nonsense, not always the most personable person, and a remarkably practical man who always spoke concisely and rarely expressed emotions. He wasn't someone who was concerned with playing politics or engaging in superficial social niceties. He could be ruthless and brutal in his mindset, but he was undoubtedly effective. He did, in war, the most important thing. He won. Based on some of these traits, he's almost like a stereotype or a caricature of an ISTJ, an extreme version, but that's why I think he's a good example. If you compare him to his most famous rival, Napoleon, who's almost certainly an ENTJ, Napoleon was a revolutionary, a progressive, who was happy to overturn and throw away the old ways of doing things if they didn't serve him. He was bold, a risk-taker, someone who would take a chance on an innovative and untested approach. Wellington was more traditional, and believed warfare should be conducted in a certain way, i.e. the gentleman's wars. Napoleon was an offensively minded, attacking general, whereas Wellington was careful and defensively minded. Napoleon was sometimes careless with details and reckless, such as when it came to crossing dangerous terrain without scouting it out properly first. Wellington was always careful with details, either using many scouts or doing the scouting himself. So we have an interesting dichotomy between them. Despite having many traits and abilities in common, they completely differ in other ways. Upon realizing that Napoleon had changed warfare forever, Wellington adjusted and updated his knowledge, his skill set, his understanding. Like any well-developed and impressive version of a type, he integrated his lower functions excellently. Napoleon often found himself up against people who were experts in warfare. They knew all there was to know. They were people who would draw from their extensive experience. But Napoleon was something new. He reinvented things. He threw the rulebook out the window. Many famous generals, who were like Wellington in many ways, were arrogant in some sense. They saw Napoleon as an upstart, someone who wasn't on the same level as them, and he caught them out every time. Wellington could have easily rested on his laurels, seen himself as an expert, drawing upon immense experience, but instead he humbles himself. He realizes that the old ways, which he knows better than anyone else, aren't going to be enough. So I think he's a great example of someone who mastered the strengths of the ISTJ and put those abilities to great effect, becoming legendary. Then, when the time came, he embraced the new, saw it as a challenge. You could think of it like him embracing his extroverted intuition. He analysed and studied Napoleon, whereas Napoleon underestimated him. Despite Wellington himself saying that the Battle of Waterloo was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, ultimately Wellington was the victor. Angela Merkel. She has won praise, not by friendliness, but by a quiet, no-frills stress on competence. Merkel is not the typical thing you'd think of when imagining someone who was, during her time as German Chancellor, probably the most prominent leader in and of Europe. Rather than being one for interpersonal charisma, soaring speeches, memorable rhetoric, or grand political gestures, she was a pragmatist. Someone more akin to an exceptional administrator than a shining beacon in the public eye. She made huge changes, both domestically and internationally, through competence. She was more of a manager and steward than the conventional conception of a great leader. Whereas she is no match for someone like Obama in terms of inspirational oratory, she definitely has the edge on him when it comes to getting more passed through an apparently gridlocked political system. As is characteristic of the ISTJ type, it's about doing rather than saying, getting things done, instead of the appearance of getting things done. Many people, if we're being honest, looked upon her as being quite dull and ordinary in many respects. This, however, was largely strategic on her part. She cultivated an image of someone who wasn't trying to cultivate an image. She had a stylist who was part of her inner circle, whose main job was to make sure that no one really commented on how she looked or her fashion choices, as opposed to trying to stir up interest in those things. She made use of a wardrobe of different coloured jackets and trousers of the same design, all of which hit home a certain idea and feeling. That she is consistent, steadfast, serious, unwavering, and reliable. Extroverted feeling is a blind spot for ISTJs. It's something they don't value, don't think about much, and actively have a certain disdain for. She took the ISTJ's natural dislike for the more, in their view, superficial, FE aspects, and weaponized it. She made not caring about her image, her image. This idea of owning who and what you are is going to be a common theme amongst great versions of the types, in whatever field. They all find ways to mitigate their weaknesses in deceptively clever ways. So, great ISTJ leaders start off by maximizing their strengths, becoming experts in their field, milking and mining the depths of their experience, and achieving a level of mastery. Then, they compensate for their weaknesses. Firstly, by being aware of those paradigm-shifting moments where some of their skills and knowledge are now out of date, and they need to upgrade and be innovative in their approach. Then secondly, to try to mitigate against the negative effects of their blind spot. This is never going to be easy, nor is it likely to be a strength, but it can be managed in clever ways. If you're an ISTJ, the best way to get more videos on your type on this channel is to subscribe, if you haven't already. Also feel free to leave a comment down below and like the video. Also feel free to join our Discord server, the link to which is down below in the description.